This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our weekly board chair check-in and update meeting. My name is Will Marie Newton, and I will be moderating this call. In order to avoid background noise while the presenters are speaking, I will be muting all participants. However, you can unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question, or you can type it into the chat box. Just as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be archived on CABE's website under services. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bob Rader. I'm Executive Director of CABE, and I want to thank you all for being on this board chair check-in and updates. And we very much appreciate the Commissioner, Charlene Russell Tucker, and Desi, his deputies, for being on this call as well. I know I sort of caused a little problem because I had said it was at 1 o'clock, but they were nice enough, including the help I got from Anne Marie to set this up for now. The Commissioner and excuse me, the cabinet members say that they can stay for 45 minutes. So I'd like to leap right into talking with them. I want to remind everybody that, excuse me, allergies, I promise. You won't get anything except maybe a computer virus. I want to remind everybody that the Commissioner and his staff are nice enough to come in and address us and are always very helpful to us. I want to encourage people that board members are best known, I hope, for their civility as role models. We know there's lots of frustration out there. All of us are feeling it. And as Patrice keeps saying, we have to all learn to cope with uncertainty and ambiguity. These are very tough times. And to expect the state to have all the answers when nobody does is asking a little much. I want to start by thanking the Commissioner and Charlene and Desi for what they did. As you remember, we went through a little period where we didn't know what the last ditch effort to get PPE was going to be, and CERC was nice enough to step forward. So if any of the board chairs don't know this, while there may be no money available at this point for PPE from the state, certainly CERC can help coordinate, so we're not at each other's throats trying to get these materials. So I want to thank again. I want to thank the State Department for doing this. Commissioner, I have a few questions. I know board members have questions, so let me just open the floor up to you first. If you want to say something to start, and then we'll circle back. I'll do my questions, and then we'll take board chair questions, either through just waving and letting us know if you're on, and or the chat box. So with that, Commissioner.
Thank you. Good morning. Nice to be with you. Thank you for the invitation. Bob and Patrice, thank you for your continued partnership. I think I see more of Bob than I do my own children these days.
How lucky.
You know, it is critically important that we continue to hear from one another. As you mentioned earlier, man, if we had all the answers, it'd be a lot easier. But the reality is, this is a rolling pandemic. I'm very, very optimistic and pleased with how Connecticut is faring with regard to how what we've done over the last 3 months in terms of being one of 6 states that is recognized as moving in the right direction. One of the states that has the fewest per person infection rates, and that's giving us a lot of confidence to say that we're going to try to do as much to get the kids back into school. We need to be thinking of kids being in school as the safest place for them. And what we're trying to do now is, after getting months of input and feedback from many of our different stakeholders, including CABE, we want to finalize a plan that the governor feels comfortable with and communicate that soon. And we appreciate your patience. We appreciate the fact that in many different communities, it's been hit differently. What I can expect from Fairfield County is different than, New London County. So we understand that there's no one size fits all to this, that districts are going to be asked to look at what this means for them. And we're going to try to work closely with DPH to make sure that first and foremost, health and safety maintains the priority. It still is the priority, and gives districts an opportunity to see what these, what the guidelines are for our state, what it means for your community. I appreciate your patience. I appreciate your partnership, and know that we're working really hard to try to take into account what the thoughts are, but also make sure that the plan is in alignment with what the health and safety standards are for the state of Connecticut, which is outside of the State Department of education policy. But we're doing our very best to move quickly and be as transparent as possible in the process, knowing that part of the transparency is saying, hey, we don't have answers yet. And if we had answers a month ago, they're going to change based on what we're seeing now. And you've seen that with the graduation. I can appreciate the frustration, because quite frankly, at times I feel like, okay, we're in a good spot, and then the needle moves. And in many cases, the needle moves and helps some, and for others, they feel like they're not helped as much. And we understand that. We appreciate the concerns that were expressed, but we also have to move forward with what we know health and safety guides. I'm going to pause because I really want to get to the questions, but I want to give an opportunity first to the deputy commissioners if they have anything that they want to add.
I just want to echo what the commissioner said. It's good to be with you all this morning. And just a real quick hello to my own board chair here in Windsor, Mr. Lockhart, and to my Metacomic grandparent, Mr. Caruso. Please tell X-Man I asked about him.
Thank you. He graduated 8th grade Monday, by the way.
I'm getting old. I'm getting old.
Good morning to you all. Great to see you, and echoing my colleagues' comments, thanking you for the work that you're doing in supporting our districts, our students, and our families. And Bob, thank you. We had the conversation about PPE orders. I just literally, as we were talking, checked the CERC. They set up a portal that with a password that we can check to see our orders are coming in. They've gotten, as of this morning, 86 different either districts or schools have actually reached out to them for them to place orders. So thanks for the conversation on that. But look forward to talking with you today. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. Thank you. We know how hard you're working. We get those texts that come out late in the day, and we very much appreciate you being able to be available to us when we have questions. Commissioner, yesterday on our partners meeting, you talked about how you've been called in front of the Appropriations Committee to give testimony tomorrow. Obviously, districts are worried very much about what kind of resources will be available, if any, from the state as we head into the fall. Can you tell us what you're going to talk about and what kind of assurances, if any, you can give to districts about resources from the state? You're muted, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
We were asked to come in front of the appropriations, and I believe this is a practice that they're doing with other agencies as well. So I have a team from the State Department going in. I think at this point it's sharing updates on kind of where we are, what we foresee to be the priorities. Depending on the model and the implementation, will determine staffing needs. At this point, we haven't finalized what the fall reopen plan is. Obviously, our goal is to get something to the governor for approval. I'll be very frank with you, we're being optimistic that we can do it within the next week, but that there's still, again, it's not just our agency, there's DPH, OPM, and the Office of the Governor's input as well. But that will determine some of the fiscal requirements. We do know that we've prioritized technology devices, connectivity, social emotional support, and professional learning for teachers to be areas that we need to double down on, and we have identified those to be the priorities with any CARES funds that we get. And we're asking districts to also prioritize, where possible, device distribution, so that if in fact there is a second wave, students have access to at least remote learning that's in some cases better than their experience the first time around. So we are going to be sharing that. We're going to be sharing our priorities in terms of what we've identified with any governor's funds. But we're also going to recognize that districts are going to have different needs. You know, we know transportation has come up as a major concern, and we're prepared to share that these are concerns that have not been, you know, haven't been addressed nationally. I was on the phone with commissioners this morning in different states. Transportation seems a big issue. Potential staffing needs will be an issue. So our job is to elevate what we foresee to be issues that may come up in the fall after the reopening plans are set.
Thank you, Commissioner. And you took my second question, which is that some of our boards feel that transportation is really the key to this. You know, they're very concerned if they're going to end up with 10 kids on a bus that'll take all day for the kids to get to school in the morning. Do you want to address that, or?
Sure.
Okay, great.
Happy to address that. I mean, there's nothing here that I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm with you. I'm looking at this, scratching my head, saying, how can we work this? What I am comforted knowing is that in reviewing and having conversations with colleagues across the country, what they're thinking is, you know, there's what we knew in April, or what we thought in April, especially when, you know, together, Bob, because you were a part of that process as well, we developed summer school guidance. What we knew then is different than what we know now. And I'm glad to see that what we're finding is that some of the restrictions earlier on were based on the data that we had then and the science that we had then. Keep in mind, this is 4 months old, 5 months old, this whole thing. You know, an example of that is the summer school guidance that came out. May 15th was the first draft. June 1st, it was kind of finalized. We wrote that late April. If you recall, the peak in Connecticut was April 22nd, 23rd. So we were looking at those data. We didn't know that Connecticut was going to be one of the, you know, 6th highest, you know, trending in the right direction states in the country. But what we're able to do now is forecast, if we continue with the success, some of the requirements that we put into summer school won't be needed, and that we can perhaps put more than 10 students on a bus. If we promote positive precautionary measures such as social distancing as much as possible, face coverings, put the windows down, get airflow. So it might be that we're not going to require the spacing that we did when we came up with summer school guidance. Again, we came up with that 2-3 months ago based on what we knew then. And we're evolving in our understanding of how this is spread, and we're evolving in our thinking of how to reduce transmission. You know, initially, checking everyone's temperature was the strategy, right? What we're hearing now is that doesn't necessarily, that hasn't been recognized over the last 3 months as a effective strategy in identifying, you know, COVID, people that have COVID, but looking at symptoms and so I think we're going to continue to evolve, and we have a challenge of predicting 2 months out. If you recall, a lot of the business reopening plans, they don't want to guess 2 months out where we're going to be. We have the challenge of having to predict 2 months out for fall reopening. And we're going to do our very best to say the data that we've seen over the last 2 months is giving us the ability to forecast out that if we continue this way, we can come in at this rate. And we're going to try to be clear about when you back up, right? So let's say you come in and then there's an outbreak somewhere. At what point do you start to scale back a little bit to make sure that we're keeping health and safety as our priority? So a long-winded answer to say, I don't have any magic answers, but I do know that the trends are showing that some of the precautions that we took before might be a little bit more than needed in the fall.
Great, thank you. One of the questions we just got from a board chair is, what about the requirements that every kid have a seat on a bus? Is there any way that could be waived in light of what's happening as far as social distancing? and because some parents don't want to put their kids on the bus at this point, at least for the fall.
You know, we haven't finalized anything, but one of the things that we're thinking is to provide as much opportunity as possible to get students into the school or to get students learning, is not only recommending and requesting that parents consider alternative transportation methods, but also where possible, is distance learning going to be an option for those families who are not going to send their children or don't feel comfortable sending their children. Keep in mind, any topic, you have people in Connecticut that are on both extremes. You have people that say, you're not going to make my child wear a mask. And there's others that say, if less than 100% of the people have masks, you're not going to see my child in the school. So it's a tough position to be in, but we have to make sure that we're providing some guidance that's based on what we know, and DPH is really helping us. But we also have to come up with strategies like what you just mentioned to say, listen, is it possible to bring your children to school a different way so that we're not relying on the bus? That might help us get transportation situation fixed a little better.
Great, great. See a question, Greg Cava, Chair of Region 12. You're muted. Marie? Marie, can you unmute Greg?
Greg? Okay, let me find him.
There, I'm unmuted now. Sorry about that.
Good.
Commissioner, I want to thank you and your deputy commissioners and your staff for all of your hard work on this and keeping us all in the loop. That's very much appreciated. On the topic of masks, I wanted to point out to you that there is an article in this morning's Washington Post about a situation in Florida where a hair salon reopened. They had two hair people who tested positive for COVID-19. One of them treated 84 clients, another treated 59. The Florida rules required both parties to wear masks, and after 14 days, they discovered no transmissions of the virus from two people who had tested positive and worked while they were visibly sick. So I would suggest that we look carefully into the issue of masks, and we treat the wearing of a mask much as we treat uninoculated children. You don't wear it, you don't attend. Because if that turns out to be the thing that stops transmission, it's the only way we can safely open, I think, is to pay attention to things like that. So I'd urge you folks, everyone, to check out that article in today's Washington Post about the Florida hair salon.
Thank you, Greg. You know, in talking about epidemiologists, three things are the best predictors of community spread: hand washing, facial coverings, and where possible, distancing, right? Now, there's no hard and fast rule about 6 feet either. I mean, that's a recommendation, right? But, you know, if you think about classrooms, you look at going in and out of the classroom, there's a small door, right? So to assume that everyone's going to maintain 6 feet always, you can't open schools. So social distancing where possible, facial coverings to reduce, as you mentioned, Greg, transmission where it's controllable, and just frequent cleaning, not only of your hands, but of the locations, right? So what we're hearing more and more from the health experts is the common sense measures are going to go a lot farther than anything that you're going to spend a lot of money on. So I appreciate you sharing that, and you know that we are having deep conversations about what does this mean for our schools, and to what extent are we willing to say it's required. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks.
And I don't know if Charlene or Desi, feel free to jump in. And I know, Lon, you have your hand up, but I want to give my devs a chance if they wanted to chime in also.
Lon?
Sure. First of all, thank you for coming on and facing all of us today, because I'm sure you've heard our frustrations, and we're hearing it from parents. So it's been really tough. And it's good to hear that there is a plan, because I think some of the concern that we had was that there wasn't necessarily a plan in development. So it's good to know that there is one. So that's helpful, that we can go back to our boards with. What we found on the municipal side of things, I'm on my local municipal reopening committee, is that the plans that came from the state, were enforceable to some degree, but they also gave the municipalities a lot of flexibility in how that gets executed on a case-by-case basis. And I think the biggest frustration that I have had as a board member is that we've been stuck in a rut here, not knowing whether or not these guidelines are going to be guidelines or strict mandates. And as a result, we haven't moved forward in a lot of planning, because we don't want to go down the road of spending a lot of money and getting all this equipment in to find out what we can do. So the misters, for example, like apparently you can't have the misting machines now from DPH, right? So all of that stuff. And my biggest frustration has been the fact that we had the teachers up until yesterday because they all just went home for the summer. So if we had a little bit of an idea as to what we would be allowed to regulate ourselves versus what was coming down from the state, we could have had 2 or 3 weeks of teacher time to start working on classrooms and that sort of thing. That's now in the past. But I'm just curious, obviously you can't talk about the plan until the governor approves it, but are we looking at the same flexibility that the municipal guidelines have been for restaurants and businesses and churches, or is it going to be more strict in how you plan to execute it?
Lana, first of all, I want to acknowledge the challenge as a board member. You're accountable to your constituents, and they want answers now. And I appreciate that. It's a tough time to be a board member right now. I know none of you signed up for this. Maybe Bob did, because Bob Surfry can handle anything. He's the man. But I appreciate that, and I guess if we would have come up with something 2 weeks ago, we would have had to change it based on what we know now. And I think it might have been a tougher position for boards. As I mentioned earlier, we worked really hard, and Bob was a part of this, to this reopening advisory team. And then from that point, we had to get to the writing of the plan with input from the governor's office. And so there had to come a point where we're just putting, pen to paper to put something together that the governor's looking at, and we're looking at the national landscape, how it's changing. So I acknowledge the timing of it isn't, believe me, the graduation guidance with the timing of it. Oh my goodness, it was so tough, and I get it. You're getting calls from parents, so I appreciate that. I don't want to skip past that, and thank you for that. We are hoping to provide like non-negotiable guidance based on DPH input, but what one commissioner called it the guardrails. And then districts are able to fill in the blanks based on your community. You might have school space that others don't. So we don't want to limit your ability to do something that other schools cannot do. So I think what you're going to expect is something that gives districts flexibility. And I have to mention that Bob has been a big advocate from the beginning in making sure that district boards and superintendents have an opportunity to take a loose structure and say, what does this mean for us? So that's what you can expect. If you recall, the summer school guidance did less of that. And what we're trying to do now is say, while it's dangerous to predict where we're going to be with this health crisis, we need to give districts an opportunity to weigh in on what this means for them. So I hope that shares a little bit about what we're thinking. There are certain things that we're hearing from the Department of Public Health that we really shouldn't, we're not going to compromise because we don't, we're not health experts, and the feeling is that, something as simple as maintaining social distancing where appropriate, face coverings should be worn by certain people. Those are some things that we want to make sure we're clear on, so that there's not discrepancy, because I don't want students in your or staff in your district to be any more or less safe than in a neighboring district. Does that make sense? But I appreciate the challenge and the timing of it all.
Thank you,
Charlene, do you want to share a little bit more about maybe the processes that we use with other agencies to try to get this information?
Thank you, Commissioner. And for the good of the group, be aware that we're spending a lot of time combing through the approach that other states have used. There are many, many plans that is out there. And so we're looking at that. With DPH, they're also looking very closely at the CDC guidance. That's there. But I'll go back to something the Commissioner said, which I know, Lana, I saw you nodding at, is the equity at the forefront of this is really important. This is a time for us to be sure that we don't have students in one place experiencing something very different than students in other places, just broadly from the equity standpoint. So that's a point of that we're having to navigate as well in terms of the considerations that we will be encountering. But be assured that we're having a lot of conversations with our Department of Public Health. That's very much a part of the conversations that we're having every day, because they truly are a big part of guiding the health aspects of what's going on in the state based on how we're trending in the state in our infection rates.
Charlene, to your point, I think it's important that folks understand that as we are crafting this plan. It's not done in a silo. It can't be done in a silo. So we have agency partners that we have to work with, looking at national and frankly international plans of what is out there, and what are other folks doing and have done. So we're guided. We have a lot of information that we're using to guide us. But I do want to just reiterate, we're not doing this in a silo. It is an interagency effort because it affects more than just education.
I'll just add one more thing, Desi, the transportation piece, which I know is such a big part of people's thinking. There's a national transportation group that they've called all the transportation guidance that about 25 states have put together, and they've distilled that basically showing that just about all of the states have been following the CDC guidance right around that. So our folks are looking at that as well, as long as getting input from our transportation folks as well about what they can or what they may or may not be able to do safely. So that is basically a part of that and the input that we're having as we develop the plan.
Great. We have some questions in the chat box. I appreciate you answering one of them, Miguel. One of the questions is, are you looking at attendance policies, since many parents may feel they don't want to immediately bring their kids to school when we will start?
Sure. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge, and I see Michelle on and I followed some of her posts about equity, and I just appreciate that. Like, we have to come together as a state and be better than we were before March 12th. We have to bring to the surface the issues, and I know Board Member Harris also very passionate about making sure we're monitoring and making sure our kids are better off. A year from now, we need to be better than we were on March 11th. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Yeah, attendance, yes. What I'm finding too is we want to promote students staying home if they're not feeling well. So that's another thing that I said, the common sense strategies. If you're not feeling well, if you have a fever, if you're feeling lethargic, you're going to be encouraged to stay home and potentially follow up with your PCP to get to assess it. We don't want to penalize students for being home. We don't want to put pressure on parents for feeling like, oh, am I going to get in trouble if my kids? No, you're following the rules. So we have to think about that. That may not be what you're going to see when we put out the first set of guidance, right? Because we don't want to just rush through that. We want to think about, what does that mean? What guidance are we giving our districts? In some places they're talking about disincentivize or stopping any incentives for perfect attendance, because you don't want kids to come to school if they're not feeling well. That's something that we have to kind of rethink. And then if the option to learn from home exists, we also want to make sure that we're taking that into account into the process. And Lon mentioned something earlier that I think is worth sharing. I don't know where we're going to end up with this, but I do know that we need to think about how we're giving teachers time to process everything that has changed. Not only with pandemic and health and safety procedures, but the country has gone through a lot in the last couple of months, and kids have experienced this. Kids have been watching TV. They've been seeing what's happening. How are we going to give our teachers an opportunity to digest and think about what their role is? Don't think on day one you're going to open up the math book to page 4 and start with fractions. We have to capture this opportunity to say, hey, we've experienced this together. How do we now operate in schools safely? What are the things that we recognize that we're compromising or that we're not able to do that we did before? And how does that make you feel? How can we as a community learn to grow forward and be as safe as possible? And then the students have experienced, in some communities, there's been a lot more loss than in other communities. So I know some of you are going to be welcoming students back, students that have lost a parent. We have to acknowledge that schools are going to be the place where kids are going to come and look for that support. So how are we supporting our teachers and our school structures to be prepared for that and not think that our opening is going to be like last opening? We have to start thinking about how it's different. So Lon, I wish we had something where you can think about that for your teachers before they left. But I think what we're trying to do as an agency also is think about, how do we embed this support for our teachers and our leaders in a way that gives them the tools to be successful when they do welcome students back. We're thinking about that, and we're thinking, how can we influence something in that capacity? So just wanted to throw that out there.
Commissioner, I'd like to add just back to the attendance pieces, you know how critical that is, that we're also looking at what laws needs to be looked at that we have to pay attention to. For example, we know there's a truancy law, right? And all those kinds of things. And I know with past groups, we've asked to share with us your thinking around that as well, as our legal director is kind of putting together a list of things that we need to consider. So anything related to attendance related is something that we may need to take a look at. But I also want this group to know we recognize that student well-being is still very important. So we have a nice partnership with the Department of Children and Families. They, commissioners from DCF, Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, a week or so ago was on a call with some of our superintendents and school districts with district attendance teams, really having conversations about the balance between student well-being and reporting a family, right? Because you're not able to make contact, and developing strategies and sharing best practices for going out and reaching out to families versus maybe an immediate call, and how to recognize the distinctions to make sure that we're still looking at student well-being. So that's a beginning of the conversation, not the end, but looking to see where we may have to look at some laws. The last thing I'll say on that, we listened to families in a town hall, and they asked for parent choice, was what they said. And especially coming from parents who have children who are immunocompromised, that says, you know, I don't care what you're doing, I'm not going to be comfortable for my child to come back. So of course, that's an attendance factor as well that we have to think about.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charlene. And I know you're working on social emotional learning and how we prepare not only our children, but our staff as they come back, because some of them have lost people as well. Candace had a question.
Thanks.
I'm
unmuted.
Can I respond to a question that was written and then we take the next question? Because I think it's important that everyone hear this. So the question was, you know, you mentioned non-negotiables. What do you mean by that? So we don't want there to be discrepancies between how Dave Fury district chooses to close a school if there is an infection rate and Vincent Mastaro. So what we're trying to do is get some level of consistency with regard to, from a health and safety standpoint, what are the health indicators that you should consider if you have to scale back a bit? So when I talk about non-negotiables, it really has to do with those health and safety principles that have to undergird our plan. What I don't want is there to be a district that feels like, well, everybody around me is doing this, so I have to do it now. It should be based on what your district is experiencing. So we want to try to provide some clarity for all of you so that you're not guessing or you're not making decisions that are absent the health indicators that you need to have in order to make those decisions. I hope that helps clarify.
Good. Candace, do you want to ask your question still?
Yes, please. Thanks, Bob. Thank you, Commissioner. It's kind of a two-parter. One is, well, first of all, I appreciate it. Sounds like you're moving in a direction of potentially a less stringent direction, because it seems like Connecticut, I think I read the other day that we're literally the state that's doing the best out of all the states right now in terms of the transmission or the percentages of the positive testing. So I guess my question is really about the CDC guidance, because that is geared toward the entire country, and so many parts of the country are doing much more poorly than we are at this point. Hopefully everyone will do better eventually, but if we're in a better position, you know, is that guidance even really the most relevant for us? And then the second part of my question is, it sounds like you're suggesting this a little bit, but I'm curious if we'll have plans similar to what they've done for the business reopenings, where there are certain phases and certain criteria and what that looks like, so that we can predict more than one model for the fall. Like, we're just scenario planning in our district, and we also don't know exactly which scenario will come to pass, but if we could narrow it down to maybe 2 things that could happen, that would be helpful.
Thank you for the question. you know, to the latter part, what we're going to do is give districts the opportunity to think about how these guidelines impact their district, and if there was a need to scale back, what would that look like? The goal is to have as many students in the school as possible. You know, I think safety, think about safety, you know, this is how our thinking has shifted a little bit too. Let's say we were to say students are going to be in school 3 out of 5 days, we have less control over behaviors of students that could be risky behaviors if they're not in school, and then they're going to be coming back to school. So to what extent is looking at our facilities differently going to be the best approach to maintain public health, right? And I think that's where the expertise of the folks in the districts will really be helpful. And to your point about the CDC guidelines, you're absolutely right. They're guidance, right? And Connecticut, thankfully, because of the hard work of the Connecticut people to really take it seriously and limit things that they could have limited, we've fared better than most states. We have to keep that in mind as we plan forward, which means just like I don't expect Fairfield County schools to take the same necessarily steps as New London County schools, where there are maybe no infections in that whole community. I have to be realistic and say the CDC guidance is out there to promote good habits, but to what extent do we have to mandate that? Because a strict adherence to 6 feet might be less safe for our kids, because we can't put them into school and they're going to be outside now, and they're more likely to be hanging around without masks, without social distancing. So your point is well taken, and I think what we're trying to navigate now with our partners at the DPH is what balance is the best balance for Connecticut. And as you might imagine, that's extremely challenging, especially because the numbers keep changing. We're fortunate we're on the right track, and we're going to take advantage of thinking to try to get as many students in the schools as possible, but keeping in mind that our plan has to be able to go backwards so that we reduce spread, like we did in March when we closed schools.
Thank you, Commissioner. Leonard Lockhart, you still have a question, Leonard?
I do. Thank you very much. And Desi, good morning to you, sir, as well as you, David. I'm thinking from a perspective of having my CABE hat on right now. I'm concerned about the children, but I'm also concerned about our staff. I'm anticipating a lot of staff possibly not want to return to our buildings, and it's going to create a domino effect where it's going to impact the urban, suburban, and rural areas where people are going to be scrambling for qualified people to teach their children. And I'm humbly believing that it's going to create a vacuum in the urban areas where there's going to be some urban teachers looking for an opportunity for quote unquote a better opportunity in another area, or suburban or rural or very high premium urban school. Mr. Commissioner, is there any consideration or anything in the think about the possibility of a shortage of teachers coming in the fall, and how do we address that?
You're muted, Commissioner.
I think I'm going to leave it unmuted. You might hear my children practicing the piano, but that's fine.
That's nice.
As long as they don't mess up too much, it's going to be nice background music. So yes, we have had conversations, and actually, you know, this morning at 7:30, I had a meeting with colleagues, commissioners from other states we're discussing these different things. So as we put out a plan with safeguards in place, we have to keep in mind that we have to make sure that our teachers and staff feel comfortable with the plan, and we have to engage them as early as possible in the conversations, so that what I started calling earlier consumer confidence, we have to have families feel confident in what we're delivering, what we're offering. We have to have students, teachers, all stakeholders. So having them earlier in the conversation would increase the likelihood that they understand the thinking behind it, and they have an understanding of how the plan is intended to keep them safe and healthy too, because you're absolutely right. We're responsible to put together a plan that's safe not only for our learners, but for our professionals as well, and our educators. But we do anticipate that for some, just like with parents, that there's a continuum. For some, they might have to make, might look at the guidelines and say, how comfortable do I feel with this? And I think every district is better prepared than the state to give you guidance on how to handle that. You need to think about what, what number that is, or what requirements, what causes that fear and concern, and work with them to address safety, but also identify, the reality that for some folks, they might still wonder whether or not it's possible for them to return. And you have to think about where you have flexibilities in contracts and human resource functions to have those conversations. I think locally, that's a better conversation than it is ever at the state level. But I do want you to think about the impact of this, and keep in mind, everything is connected. So as you start thinking about plans, getting folks involved as much as possible early on is going to pay dividends, because at the end of the day, the plan is something that has been vetted through the perspectives of the different folks in your district.
I appreciate that, Mr. Commissioner. I just don't want it to be to the point where we got 169 towns doing their own individual thing and adversely affecting their neighbors and everybody else. Because at the end of the day, I believe it's going to be those school districts that have the least amount of resources to pay teachers that's going to suffer in the end. And it's just going to create a bigger gap for all involved. I represent Windsor. However, as a board member, we're sworn for all the education for all the kids in the state of Connecticut. So I just want to speak from that viewpoint to make sure that we're very careful what we do in our towns. So I appreciate the response. Thank
you. Mr. Lockhart, I'm 110% behind you. I think, we are leaders. Some of us are elected, some of us are appointed. We are leaders now that have to hold the mantle of public education high. And sometimes it means taking ourselves out of our current position and saying, how is this affecting public education in Connecticut? What a, I don't want to say burden, but what a responsibility for us to think about the state of Connecticut as a whole. Without question, we've seen gaps prior to COVID just be exacerbated and inequities be exacerbated. And it's our responsibility collectively as elected officials to speak to that, and not, even though it's going to affect some communities more than others, to remember that we're all one Connecticut community. What happens in one community will affect another community. So I appreciate that perspective, and we never want to lose sight of that. And we want you to hold us accountable to that, because we need to make sure that we're constantly reminding all of Connecticut that it's our responsibility for all students. Thank you, Leonard.
Commissioner, can you stay a few more minutes, or you have to get somewhere else?
I can stay another 10 minutes, yep. And Desi and Charlene, I know that we adjusted our schedules. I know you have other calls also. If you have to leave, that's fine. But if you can stay, that'd be great also.
I have a few more minutes. I do want to just build on what the commissioner said when we're talking about teachers, because it's the other side of that, Mr. Lockhart, is the academic piece. And one of the things that we're going to be rolling out in the next couple of weeks through what we're going to call a CT Learning Hub are academic resources that will be available for teachers statewide, free, sort of one-stop shopping, if you will, that are aligned to standards and that are high quality, that teachers and kids and families will be able to access, that include some professional development modules. So when we talk about leveling the playing field, the academic piece is also in the forefront of what we're doing, and I want you to know that.
And it also goes to making sure their own needs are met, their own social emotional needs are met, and that's what we're looking to see as well, that we can support our teachers and our educators in general, and also those who are providing that support, or school counselors, or school, right, our school psychologists, to support them in supporting the community. And the one other thing I want to add, as I was here, I thought about, we're hearing student voices, and they're really strongly sharing to us the impact of this social isolation, not having that ability to connect and communicate in person with their teachers, with their peers. It's also causing their own impacts, and that is speaking very loudly as to what we need to do as well to address that need. Just wanted to share that.
And just as a very quick mention, next week on our board chair roundtable, we've invited the executive director of the Connecticut Association of School Counselors, as well as the person who is now working at SDE as a school psychologist, to talk about the effects of the isolation, especially on middle school children who are at an age when they're starting to break away a little from their parents and starting to rely more on their peer groups. But what happens when they can't get together and they can't talk to each other? I want to ask one more question from Bob Trefry, because I think it's a great question. And since we have started doing some work on social justice when you started, Commissioner, and we had invited Cass, Patrice was involved, as well as CAPS. Will there be resources about Black Lives Matter? And what do you see as the effects of what's been happening in the country and in Connecticut over the last few weeks, and how, at a time when we're all focused on COVID, what can you say about what we will do about these other issues?
Again, I feel compelled to say, like, if we're not taking this as an opportunity to lead, then we shouldn't be in our chairs. There are two pandemics, right? And both are deadly. Both are silent and sometimes hard to find, right? They just creep up on you. We need to, as leaders, you could be in a community that doesn't have a lot of racial diversity, and it's equally as important. Now, how we do it matters too. We have to demonstrate civility and dialogue, and kids, they're ready to have these conversations. They're having them on Instagram, on Twitter. The demonstrations that we've seen, if you saw our board meeting yesterday, we had 2 students speak on issues that were important to them. One of them chose mental health, and the other one said, I don't like the way the curriculum shows my culture in a negative way only. They're ready to talk about it. Are we ready to talk about it? So I think we need to be responsive to our students' needs, listening to them, and be prepared in the fall to have conversations of where your students are. Don't assume you know where they are, but create an environment where students are actively sharing what their thoughts are. Many students are going to return to school feeling dejected based on not only what we've seen with what's gotten a lot of attention with the killings that we know about, but also the fact that the health disparities say Black and Latinos are going to get it more, and they're going to die more frequently. So that's a reality that our students are walking in with. That's a reality that we have to be prepared. And as Charlene mentioned, we're going to try to develop that social emotional skill set for teachers and for students in a way that's supportive. As Desi mentioned, we're going to have to make sure that the materials that we provide for students are giving teachers the right tools. Because sometimes, Bob, and you know this, and members on the call, you know this too. If these conversations happen without careful integration, it could lead to worse outcomes. It could lead to greater division. I'm seeing that. I'm getting some complaints where there's some educators that have put things up, or posted things that have offended others. So we're seeing that it could divide. But I think it's critically important as leaders that we take that opportunity to say we have a responsibility to bring our schools, have our schools be places where students can have that conversation in a safe way and grow from it. We have shared some materials. I think there was June 1st. I think there was a document shared with some resources on moving forward together. And I encourage that not only do you look to the State Department, but look to each other. John might have something that I think is really helpful. And how do we use the great things that you're doing in your communities to share with others? Look to us also as a way to share best practices, because sometimes the best ideas are already happening in your districts because you have tremendous leaders over there, tremendous educators that have taken that and run with it. How can we become better as a state based on what you're doing?
And could I make an offer, which I didn't plan to, but since we're here, I'll just make the offer anyway. So the issue of equity, looms large, and I keep saying, let's not use this moment for it just to be another 6-letter word. And it really means us individually grappling with what that truly means from our leadership perspective and our spheres of influence. We brought in, and Patrice, I know you were on the call on the School Discipline Collaborative, and we brought in 2 learned scholars around critical race theory. They authored the book, Schooling for Critical Consciousness, really, which is the role of schools. And Patrice, you can certainly share what your feedback was on that. but it is addressing this issue at a deeper level. I can make those two gentlemen available to you and to this board for a conversation. I know the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus, because of that meeting we had a couple of days ago, we'll be doing that. I'm having conversations with friends. So Bob, if you want us to follow up, because it is talking about the roles of schools, and it actually challenges our own assumptions and the kinds of things that we have to do. What Patrice and I on the call, a social emotional learning collaborative call, heard was folks are quick to jump to technical fixes. Let's remove school resource officers. Let's do this, let's do that. And what Dr. Grace reminded us, that we shouldn't be jumping there without having conversations with the community most impacted, right? We're their community partners and what are our student voices in it? So to become strategic equity leaders, we've got work that we've got to do, and it starts internally with ourselves. And so I'll offer that to you. And Patrice, I don't know your thoughts about experiencing that conversation.
I agree, Charlene. I think that would be very valuable. And I think making sure that those conversations do take that broad approach, perhaps helping boards utilize the equity toolkit that CABE has developed would also be a part of that.
Great. I've got two other questions I see, and we're pretty much out of time, but if you can do it quickly.
I'll take those questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead, John.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. You've kind of touched on some of the issues. I think if this meeting were to happen a few months ago, we haven't even touched the environmental crisis. And so there are three public health crises in my view. Racism is clearly one. The pandemic is clearly one. And I guess a simple way, knowing how inundated you are with duties and responsibilities, is the State Department structurally built in a way or ready to address these kind of existential crises in the crazy limited time frame we have in a given school day, school year setup, given all of the other things that are going on at the same time?
So, you know, what we learned is, not to get too cliche here, but, you know, the whole it takes a village and, you know, the smartest person in the room is the room itself. We're foolish to think that we as an agency are going to have the capacity, the resources. What we know is that if I need somebody to advocate for arts, I'm going to call John. If I need somebody to advocate and be a champion for name the issue, we have good models. So what we're trying to do is say, how do we serve as, we know the agency, I mean, 50, I think the number is 50 or 60 people cut since the golden era, right? So what we have to do is think smarter. How do we build the capacity in our agency to connect good resources and good examples? And how are we designed to be fluid with the needs? So, you know, when I got on, we didn't have a chief academic officer 10 months ago. We didn't have a deputy for emotional supports and wellness. We didn't have that. We didn't have a director of equity and excellence, equity and language. So we had to look at the existing resources and kind of move things around and say, this is a priority now. But we're going to have to do that now with health and safety. My food and nutrition people have served over 8 million meals because of their work. 10 months ago, I honestly, you know, and I'm almost, you know, Charlene is here and she's been doing that work, but I didn't know the degree to which they were so involved. Now they become such an important part of Connecticut's efforts to feed people, right? The social emotional piece, the racial piece, that's coming to the surface. We need to evolve our design to be responsive to that. Health and safety is another area that 6 months ago, I wasn't thinking about health and safety as much as I am now. We have to evolve. So I'm not saying that I'm going to have tons of new support to do that, but I have to learn from the best practices out there, and I have to make sure that my agency is evolving to meet the demands that is placed on it. And we owe that to our students.
I just want to add one real quick thing that you should know about it. I don't know about other boards, but at our meeting last night, we had over 15 participants in public comment, which is a challenge under remote circumstances. Most of them were 4 years ago, so now they're college graduates. They graduated from high school in 2016. They call it, and they're making demands on our district to modify our curriculum to more accurately reflect the real history of the world that they feel as though they missed in Brantford, even though many of them went to Ivy League schools, which is part of the reason why they came out so strongly. It was over 2,000 signatures on one petition that a couple of recent grads. It's extraordinary. So the change is happening for sure.
Thanks.
I have so much confidence that the degree to which we include student voice will determine the success we have. I really do. And, give some thought to how are you structuring student voice so that it's not a feel-good event? Does it impact policy at the board level, at the school level, at the classroom level? That's how you determine whether or not you're really using student voice.
Meryl, I'm going to give you the last question. And
hey, Bob, can I jump in real quick before we do the last one? I just want to, because I have to jump off, but I do want to add, I think there are things happening in your districts that we want to bring to the forefront and highlight. It's not all doom and gloom. And so I'm going to put in the chat box the email address where you can send any best practices. I don't care if it's a narrative. I don't care if it's a short video. If there's any best practices that you have going on in your district that you want us to share statewide, please send it to the email that I'm going to put in the chat box. And thank you for the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you, Desi. Really appreciate it. Meryl, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, monsieur. Okay. All right. Trying to hang up. Okay. My question is, I know our superintendent has real concerns about lots of senior teachers producing doctor's notes saying they've got underlying medical conditions and that they won't be able to come back and teach in person. And I'm wondering if there is a way that we can use technology to have them teach remotely rather than paying them to stay home, and possibly pair them with a student teacher. So there is a person in the room, but it would require having both, using the Eno board or whatever the hell we call the thing, to project them up on the screen and then have a camera so they can see what's going on in the classroom. But someone referred to COVID as our wormhole to the future. And I'm just, wondering if there's a way we can use technology to get around this problem.
Thank you for the question, Meryl. Nice to hear your voice. You're bringing up, it was mentioned earlier, but you're not only are you bringing up something that everyone across the country is going to be grappling with, but you're also thinking problem solving. How can we get through this? And I think that's where the power of CABE comes in, where you can share these best practices. Obviously, district-wide, you have contracts that have certain provisions under medical leave or I don't want to communicate that we have the ability to usurp that or go around that. But I think hearing best practices or hearing out of the box thinking is what we really need to do right now, and be open to trying to meet the needs of our learners and support our staff as much as possible. Again, I'll reiterate, I think having different stakeholders as a part of this process to think about what it means for your district is going to be a critically important step to determine what those challenges are going to be. The last thing we want is the week before school starts to learn this, right? So having that conversation early, trying to problem solve together, keeping in mind that as a state, we're going to get better, we're going to learn, we're going to grow. And there might be times where, much like we had to do in March, some executive orders to facilitate some conversations or look at things differently might be needed in order to continue to move our state forward. But we're listening also for those great ideas that districts used to resolve some of the challenges that they're going to have. But we know that you can't get to those great ideas if we don't have a plan for you. And we're working to try to get that out as soon as possible so that you could do your local thinking and problem solving. Nothing's off the table. Nothing's off the table, Meryl.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. You gave us more time than we thought, and you made it at the time that our people were best off to get together. I want to invite you back.
Little secret here. I had a planned meeting with the governor to talk about our plan. And I said, well, after 2, because I have a very important 1 o'clock. So now I have more time to prep for that one.
Oh, good.
No, but the bottom line is, and I'll let you have the final word, but you've been partners through this process. I recognize how challenging for board members this is. Both you and Patrice have really, every week we've talked, we've listened. I know it's going to be frustrating. I know there's probably dark sets with the commissioner's face there, because it's like, come on, give me the answer that I want to hear. I get it. And what I don't want to do is rush and give you something that I'm going to have to walk back. And I want to make sure that you understand that, I have input in a plan, but there's other factors that are, I'm partnering with other partners also at the state level to make sure that it's as quality a plan that can serve all students. I recognize the challenge. We're in this together, and this is a marathon. I've said that before. This is a marathon. There are going to be times where we're going to come out with something, and then we're going to have to look at it again. And I appreciate your patience. I appreciate the service that you have to your communities, and I know this is a difficult time to do that, but thank you for what you're doing. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you for coming on, and Desi and Charlene, we very much appreciate all the work that you're doing, and we plan to be partners for a long time to come. So thank you very much.
And we promise to come back when we have something to share a little bit more clear. Okay.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yes.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. See you next week.